Excellent. As I said before, finishing the C major sonata today. Wonderful to spend this time with you again. And of course, if you're with me on Facebook, I'll actually see what you write in real time. So let me know where you're coming from. Here we're working our way for these last few tour stops, because as you know, next week is the last week of Bach on the road. Working our way southeast again. We're going to finish close to home. I don't think we're going to finish in Germany since we started there, but we'll finish not too far from home and hit some cultural hot spots on the way. Got some big ones. We had London last time, now Paris, and not Notre Dame. This is the gorgeous Cathedral of Sainte-Chapelle, and the light is perfect. The acoustics, we'll have to see. They may not be as perfect as we might like. And I have to tell you, it's hot in here too. Starting to heat up that time of year. So great to see you. Lisa's coming from Pennsylvania. I don't think I knew that before. Thank you. Donald from Victoria, BC again. And Michael, you you mentioned seeing the Top Chef episode with members of the LA Phil, and unfortunately I was not around for that, so I did not get to eat any of the food or any of that, but I had colleagues that did, and got to hear all about it. So I have to catch up and watch that episode. Hollywood, CA, Ingrid is here, and Joan from Minnesota. Great to see you. So the structure of this sonata, as with the other two, opening slow movement with some freedom, although in the C major, not as much as some of the others, right? We had that heartbeat. The longest and densest fugue coming next. And we got an intro to the third and fourth movements on Wednesday. This third movement, which we'll start with, a Largo, talked a little bit last time about wanting this to feel in 4 rather than 8. That's been a pretty common theme for all of these slow movements in here, right? So you get the sense that I like them a little bit faster than some, and maybe a little bit faster than I used to play them. This one, it's so beautiful, though. It would really be a shame to rush past any of the details. So this can be a delicate balance, I think, to find the tempo. So let's start there and just hear a few different choices. I'm not going to do anything really out of bounds or anything, but try this one on and see what you think. And now, try this. different. Pretty different tempi. And obviously one... Now, I will say that both of them allow for freedom. Both of them allow for motion. You may have heard that in both cases there was room for rubato there, right? A little moving ahead, pulling back. So for those of you here with me live, I'm curious your impressions of those two, if you've got strong feelings about them, or if that might be the kind of thing that you could imagine deciding in the moment. Like, maybe the fugue has gone a certain way and you're feeling the mood of the room. Comics have to do that all the time. They have to read the room, right? And I think the more that you perform live, the more you understand that you have to do that too. Not that you don't want to draw fear from an audience, like, oh no, I'm losing them, I better rush. But there are times I think you can tell, especially when you've got actual people in the room with you instead of lights and cameras, where you can tell, everybody's ready to kind of take a step back, or they want to dance with me. So I'm curious to see what you might think. You'll have to let me know later. Everybody's said, oh, all right, Christine's jumping in. The second version sounded as if I were more convinced. Well, it's interesting to hear that. Joan feels like there is more direction in the faster version. It's funny, I chose two tempos on either side of the one that I usually gravitate toward. So in both cases I thought, oof, the first one I thought, this is going to be like really fast. Was still tasteful. And the second one I thought, I'm really going to take all the time I could imagine taking, and hopefully still tasteful, but really slow. Just so you can hear it, let's pick the one in the middle, or one of the ones in the middle. Thing. Had you heard that tempo first, who knows how you might have liked it. And in a way, this talk about tempo is not the most important thing, right? Because it's actually the character that you want to put across to your listeners, but still you can't quite escape it, because it will affect, among other things, how you plan the bow, and probably the dynamic range. In general, when you don't have to hold the bow as long, you can have more range in a bow, because you can, without having to save bow at any point in this movement, you could really dig into the beginning of a slur. I probably would never quite dig in this movement, but you could really move it, and in a very short span of time give a lot of dynamic contrast. Whereas the slower you go tends to be on a little bit of a smaller scale, at least, beat to beat, bar to bar. And Joan initially liked the fast version, but now likes the middle speed. And I recommend that you try this. It's, this was the first time in quite a while that I had tried a tempo for this movement quite as fast or quite as slow as either of the first two that I played for you. But it is something that I like to do with everything that I perform, not just as an exercise, but to see what aspects of the character I may be missing in a different tempo. It's just so easy, because we want to build good habits, it's so easy to get a little bit stuck in whatever tempo we're playing, especially if you practice always slowly, and and without musical direction. That's an easy place to get stuck in, and it's a hard place to get out of because you're usually left with a week or two before a performance thinking, okay, I've got to inject some energy in here somehow. Maybe I'll just play it faster. Then that ends up changing a whole bunch of other things, and you don't have time to consolidate them. So I suggest early on, while you're still molding your conception of what the piece is going to be, try very different tempi, especially for these slower movements where there aren't a lot of technical limitations on how fast or slow I could go. The first movement of this, there's some limits on how slow I can go because some of those long bows are going to be a little too long if I choose too slow a tempo. In this one, I could really do whatever I want. And so I would encourage you to play around on both ends. There's for you golfers out there, there's a nice technique for working on those kind of mid-length putts, the ones that are too long to be just what you'd call a gimme, like I can make them every time, but they're not so long that you're just kind of taking a shot in the dark. You'd like to be able to make a putt like that. And the reason I bring this up is because a nice technique to work on those is to step back from the ball and do a stroke that is too hard. It would put the ball well past the hole, and to do a few of those. And then to do a stroke that the ball would not reach the hole. A few of those. To feel what those two boundaries feel like, and then to pick something nice and easy in the middle. And you don't necessarily always want to end up in the middle tempo-wise. Sometimes you might want to push the envelope, and you might want to stick with your faster version, or give yourself all the time that a slower version gives you. But at least then you've tried it, and you can hear the differences. We talked a little bit about intonation in this one, and it's not the first thing that most people think of with this movement, but it is pretty treacherous. Luckily, the bass line is a little bit spread out. We've got wait a beat, etc. And then the low F, which I can't play. So it would be great if that bass line the pitches sounded totally satisfying, as if they were a melody. Perfect fourths. That would be great. Maybe close half steps might be great. And I might have to try to do that if the bass line notes were closer together. But here, they're pretty spread apart, and I've got a lot of melody on top. So I can probably get away with making some choices that don't require the bass line to sound like a melody. So for example, if it were just a melody, I'd probably put that F, the very first note of the piece, I'd probably put it a little bit low so that I could have it nice and close to the E. However, if I do that against an open A, yikes, that A is not going anywhere. So either I could avoid the open A, play it in third position, use the F that I want, therefore a lower A, instead of, I've got my nice low F and nice low A now. But then I'd probably have to use the covered A again. It would sound strange if I... And then all of a sudden there's the bright one. I might now also have to lower this. It just sets the whole thing a little bit lower. And if that's worth doing, then I'll do it. I want this to sound as satisfying as I can. But maybe instead, I'm just going to put the F a little higher. Make it ring with my open A. And then I can feel free to mix covered D's and A's and open D's and A's without fear. That to me is a simpler solution and just as satisfying. Similar thing here. Now this perfect fifth has to be in tune with itself, but am I going to put it there, or the brighter one always sounds bad after the lower one when we're talking about flats, but I have to keep in mind the open strings that are going to be around. Somewhere around there matches with the open D, therefore nice and bright. That's too bright. Here with the bass notes a little closer, I've got to give a little more thought to So, as always, to some folks, the pitch questions are tedious, and it may seem like these are the kind of things you would only tweak at the very end after you've solved all the other problems. And it's true. I wouldn't want you, if you're working on this movement, I wouldn't want you to get stuck thinking only of this for a whole week or something. But it's worth thinking about simply because it makes you listen to more than one voice at a time, and it makes you listen, as I've said before, both horizontally and vertically together. And that's the only way for you to get all the riches out of this music, and certainly for your listeners too. If you leave it till the last minute, it's like, house of cards. You move one note and then that's going to change this other one. Whereas if you've taken all this into consideration as you're learning it, it's so much easier. Let me see. And Robert, you mentioned, absolutely, something I neglected to mention, the place that you play is going to play a big part in choosing the tempo. And that's always going to be true, whether you're talking about solo playing, especially ensemble playing. As the number of people multiplies, as the amount of sound multiplies, you get more and more sound just billowing around the room. And so, right, as Robert says, the more live, the more ring an environment is, the more ringing an environment is, generally there's that upper limit to how fast you want to play. For example, the last movement, when we get to that, here in this dry environment of Sainte-Chapelle Cathedral, the actual environment I'm playing in, I could go blazing fast as long as my hand allowed it, and you could hear every note because we've got no ring. That live environment, you do that, it's going to be a big blur, and it might sound impressive to some people, but it can be a little bit hard to follow. So that's a great point. And Joan enjoys the discussion of intonation. Well, I'm happy about that. And you're not wrong to do it, as you mentioned, instinctively or by ear. I mean, in the end, how are your listeners going to hear what you're playing with their ears, right? And you simply don't want your intonation to be a distraction. So it's all going to be about what sounds good. But it is worth going beyond just our instinct or our habit and, making some intelligent choices too. That's one of the great things about developing control over pitch. Not only so that you can play all the pitches in the same place every time, but so that you can choose. Most of the time, I'm grateful just to have them close enough to the middle, most or all of the time. I just did a little recording project yesterday that'll go up on the LA Phil website, hopefully in these next couple weeks. And intonation. You listen to these takes and watch yourself on video, and it's like, I really thought I had that, thought I practiced that, thought it was going to come out where I wanted, and, things happen. But especially in these slower movements where we've got a little bit more time to think, nice to make some creative choices. Now, Charlotte, you asked about trills and how to decide what kind of trills, and by that I assume you mean, do you start from above the note or from the note? So let me know if that's not what you meant. And that's a great question. Actually, something that we haven't talked much about in this series. As much as people might like to pretend that there are set rules for this stuff, I just haven't ever read a convincing account that tells me that there are set rules. The more conductors and performers, the more great conductors and performers I work with who play mostly Baroque music and early classical music, the more of them I work with, the more I and my colleagues tend to trill from above the note. But there are exceptions to that. So let's talk about some of those. And I have to say I owe a debt to a former colleague from the Chicago Symphony, David McGill, who was the principal bassoon there and now teaches full-time. But he wrote a great book called Sound in Motion, and it looks at a lot of issues just like this one. Yeah, ones that you just do on instinct, and he asks you to consider why. For example, there's a great part of the book that tells us the way we've all been thinking about we're getting maybe as far away from Bach as we can with Wagner there, but from Ride of the Valkyries, he asks us to look at the score and to notice that figure always starts with a pickup. Bum bum ba-dum bum. So then the next iteration of it should also be with the pickup. And this kind of thinking comes into play all the time, especially in the fast Bach movements, how you phrase and how you group things. So now a pickup. And he can't resist sort of poking his former brass colleagues for always breathing which is how I had always thought of the phrase, on the beat. But he makes a very strong case for why it's from before the bar. A similar chapter on trills, and so this is what we're going to talk about here. If I have a default, it's to trill from above, because the trill is used as a decoration of the note. And so it's nice to start with the decoration rather than the main note. The very first trill we've got here in the second is in the second bar. So our choices are or now here I have yet another clue or a piece of evidence. We've got a gap. And so I like to fill that gap, in other words, to trill from the C. So that choice is pretty clear to me. But the next trill we have is in bar 4. Or again, coming from above, I feel it's more natural to keep the upper note. Bar 6, though. Now, the trill is shorter, and we've got, it's in the middle of a line. Here, I feel like I don't quite have time. I would rather hear, so that each note changes on the bow change. Uh-huh. And a bar 7. I'm trying to see if there is one that would be an exception in this movement. In this movement, I'm not seeing any exceptions, except for that one I just mentioned where I would trill from the note. The big instance in which I would trill from the main note if I had something like I would not play and the reason there is that I'm on my way to resolving to a C, so I would not want to anticipate that. Even though it's part of the trill, I wouldn't want to draw attention to the C to take away from that arrival. There might be other matters of context that would overrule me there, but yeah, those are my general thoughts on these trills. And you'll often hear me too, just one more thing on trills, start a trill a little bit slower and warm into it, at least when there's time, like in bar 7. That's a little more pleasing in this context than just starting right off with, like, you know, telephone ring. Right. And I don't trill all the way to the end. Always end with a little bit of expression on the note. Or if I weren't using vibrato at all, maybe if I were playing with a conductor that said we're not going to use vibrato this week, then it would I would still end with a little bit of the note itself untrilled. Otherwise it feels like you're kind of running into a trill wall there. Good. Oh, Holly mentions that this is a the chapel, not a cathedral. I suppose Sainte-Chapelle would be a clue to that. And thanks for the kind words about the play. Good. And now Haruka, you ask, aside from perfect fourths and fifths, leading tones, do I have a clear method by how I decide which notes to prioritize being in tune with certain notes over other double stops? I think it just depends on the most important factors of the moment. In order, they would be perfect intervals within a chord or a double stop. Those are just non-negotiable, right? Unisons, perfect fourths, fifths, and octaves, they have to be the same. I think the next priority would be a note that appears either adjacent to a note or maybe just 2 notes away or something, but same kinds of intervals, especially unisons, octaves, fifths, and fourths. So if I have something like, clearly those A's need to be the same. I can't, even if I've got double stops around, I can't, the A's have to be the same. They're so close together. And then I suppose after that would be other intervals in chords. I mean, thirds and sixths have room for interpretation, as do tritones and seconds and sevenths and all that. Those need to sound pleasing, In general, that means that in a major chord or a major triad, the third rings better when it's lower. So the very last chord of this movement, and I'm about to play the whole movement, is a perfect example, unless I want to go to the trouble of playing it up in position to avoid the open string. That's pretty fussy, though. And I would do that so that I could have a lower A, a lower third. Same as we were talking about the first chord of the opening. Because I'd rather not do that, I don't like the closed sound there. I'd like it more open. I have to live with a little bit of rankling that high open A string just for a moment. Just for a moment. The two Fs must be the same. I can't solve it by having a high F there and then a low F there. So for me, solves it well enough and gives me the sound I want. So I think Haruka, it's about, those would be my priorities. And then sort of equal with making thirds and sixths sound good would be the melodic or the expressive intonation, half steps tight, things like that. And Joan, you ask, it seems like I need to tune my violin pretty often. And yeah, so why is that? Two big factors. The biggest one is that, right, since I'm not actually in Paris at the moment, this garage has some pretty wild swings of temperature, depending on, yeah, mostly the weather. But I've also got some lights on me that put out some heat, as well as the fans, exhaust fans of the electronics. So in general, it tends to be pretty hot and dry in this garage. And so, you know, I keep the case humidified. I take it out here. It's hot and dry. And the strings, the instrument is going to adjust some. Compounding that, I do play on these Pure Astro Passion strings, gut core for the G, D, and A. They respond more to weather and humidity than some other strings. You know, I think you've also noticed too that sometimes I get to the end of the movement and the open strings sound pretty terrible. Hopefully the movement didn't sound terrible. So part of learning to perform is learning to adjust these things on the fly. And that used to be a much bigger deal when everyone played on not just gut strings, but even raw gut strings. And Heifetz, for example, he would not have allowed me to tune my instrument during a lesson like that. I would have simply had to sit on it. He would yell at people if they did that and say, you have to learn how to deal with it, and you know, that's part of the job. So yeah, maybe that's a good reminder not to tune as often, but I'm still going to do it before I play this whole movement through. But I don't have to do it as loud. All right, let's hear the entire Largo. And this one actually has no repeat. It's one of the few slower movements that doesn't. couple things I always remember things as I'm playing. One place where when I was younger I wouldn't have picked up on this. Bar 13 is a perfect example of a bass line that can be a little bit confusing at first glance if you're only going by the lowest notes. Because you have G on the bottom. And then now it sounds obvious what I'm going to say, but of course that's just a descending bass line, right? But because of the octave shift, doesn't always appear as such at first. And one other interesting tidbit, bar 17, every other time that figure comes, it would be like in the first half. But of course now we don't have that low F, so he has to, and he makes a great bass line out of it, right? And this is another one of those that has not just one surprise, the fact that we don't finish right there at bar 18. Then it seems like, okay, we had this little tag and we're still going to resolve to F. Yeah. And no dynamics written in this entire movement, but clearly got to make a decision one way or the other. I think either to crescendo into that, or what I did, as if we're gonna I think it's impossible to play. I can't imagine how that would work. It's too turbulent, that chord. So a couple of your questions before we go on to the Allegro. Bar 7, rolling the chord in reverse. No. You mean because the bass line would continue there. I don't, partly because I almost never, well, I don't think I ever roll them top to bottom, but you could make an equally convincing case that you want to switch to the top line there anyway. You have so that's sort of, it could go either way, and since I find it more satisfying to roll from the bottom anyway, I do it there. And then as far as the strings, these are the strings I always use. They're a little bit lower tension in general, and I like that setup for this instrument. If you do want to try these strings, I would suggest that you also, once we're all free to go see our luthiers again, luthiers, get them to find a position for the sound post and the bridge and everything that also loosens the instrument up a bit. It does not work to have a sound post usually shoved way in really tight and then to put these strings on. They're going to sound like that. The instrument needs to be able to ring a little bit more, and then I find that these have as much or even more projection than some other strings, especially at a distance, where you get all the amazing complex overtones that these strings are known for. So I use them for everything. And Joanna, I would say this was the middle tempo. This is the one I'm used to playing. Great, let's look at this last movement, Allegro. And we've covered a lot of the concepts of how to practice these fast movements, how to memorize them. today I'd like to talk about string crossings. That's, there are two big challenges bow-wise in this movement. One of them is all the string crossings. There's every kind of pattern. We've got and the reverse, and we've got, so sometimes it's on separate bows, sometimes it's slurred. Now without, I don't want to make every note sound the same, but rhythmically I do. I want to be able to present an unbroken string of brilliant 16th notes. It just, it's water running over the rocks down waterfalls and all that good stuff, Quicksilver. And I can't do that if I'm hung up on the string crossings or hung up on whether I'm slurring or playing détaché. So this movement, out of all the movements of Bach, I take more liberties. I do more bowings of convenience than I probably would for any other movement. And if someone just asked about which edition, I like any edition that lets me see what was originally in the manuscript, and then if there are suggestions after that, that's great, but I need to see at least what the material is. So certainly Bärenreiter and Henley are great for that. Henley may include one clean part and one that has suggestions. I learned these originally with the international edition that Ivan Galamian edited, and I rely on that a lot less these days, but in a movement like this, he had some very good and practical suggestions about bowing. If you look, what are a couple of the issues that you come into right away? And I'm now at the tip, because I've had a lot of slurs on down bows. I actually forget if he suggests doing some hooks or separating things at this point yet. That I don't do here. I just save my bow on the slurs and use the first few separate notes to work my way down. So I'm not stingy, but I'm, judicious with the bow there so that I can still be in the middle. I work my way back down. Even though it's 7 notes of a slur, I try not to go too far past the middle so that I can work my way back down a little bit. If you've never tried that, that's a skill well worth knowing for Bach and any playing really, because you can then put yourself in any part of the bow at any time rather than having to change the bowing and figure out these complicated bowing systems. It's a lot easier just to keep what's on the page usually and move yourself. So to do a scale in separate bows, for example, starting at the frog, without making it obvious, putting an accent on every down bow, but to finesse it such that they sound basically even, but you're transporting yourself. And then back down. It's the kind of thing that's almost easier faster. At least to make some change. There, I didn't do it quite as well as I wished. I heard a little inégal, as some people do that deliberately in this kind of music. I heard a little bit of that as I tried to transport myself. Here, it doesn't have to be nearly that dramatic. You're just getting from the 2/3 point back to the middle, or from the 1/3 point back to the middle. And so compact, and then when you can open it up, to do so. I've got 8 separate notes. Then I can go to town. So here, from here almost to the end of the page, the bowings I play bear some resemblance to what's in the manuscript, but there are a number of changes. I slurred those two so that I can be on an up bow, and as well as slurring the last two. If you stick with down bows on beats, I mean, it's not unplayable. It's a little bit less comfortable than... And there may be times where you actually want the extra effort of the uncomfortable bowing because it'll give you a little bit more articulation, a little bit more clarity, less smooth. Instead of... Here, though, I want that smoothness if I can get it, and just a little gentle... Yeah. It's those kind of changes, basically, the whole movement through. Sometimes I'll do them as a hook. Sometimes I just add a slur. I don't think it detracts from the music at all. And then it frees my mind to concentrate on the harmony and deciding what beats, what chords are more or less important. If we looked, for example, at 21, two bars. Sometimes, if you do it all the time, it can be a cliche, of course, to do the echo effect. But sometimes, people do it because it works. Now here, instead of 2 bars and 2 bars, I've got a chord with dissonance. And then, or a whole bar with dissonance, I should say. And then resolution, and then resolution. So I'm going to more importance on the dissonant bars. Here, though, it's not quite so neat. One bar doesn't resolve into the next. It stays. So instead it's a D pedal point, so I'm going to keep the tension. And then finally, once we've reached that, then I can relax it. This great ending. To bring us back. As far as navigating the string crossings themselves, the more frequently you go between strings, the less arm motion you want. And so for something like that very first bar 5, except for the very first note, we've been coming from the D string. Now I'm going to park my bow on that level right in between the A and E strings, because every other note I'm going to play in the bar is on those 2 strings. So for the downbeat, the next bar, move it back to the D and A double stop level, and then back. So the general rule is, if you're just crossing between 2 strings, put your arm in the middle and your hand can navigate between the 2 strings. If you bring a 3rd string into it, then the arm needs to get involved to transport you. So in tempo, and from this angle, so it's building over time an awareness of where you are and where you're going, so that you don't get caught out of position and have to move, the whole apparatus just to move over one string. And now you ask about vibrato during a fast movement. In this movement, especially the tempo I'm going to take, it's going to be fast. There's not going to be that much time. It'd basically just be the last note of each half. But not very wide, because I don't want it to suddenly stand out like that. And, oh yeah, Charlotte, you asked a great question about why it's more uncomfortable to be, and it was answered very well by Joan. Yeah, it's that whole figure 8 thing, as opposed to just where it's a circle here. It's just going like that way, as opposed to that way. Good. Give it a play. This has 2 repeats, but I won't do them. I'll spare you. I almost did the thing where if I missed some stuff, I was going to take the repeat just to give another chance. Whereas if I'd gotten everything, then don't take the repeat. There's a lot to get in this movement. Hard not to let the wheels start to come off. But like I said, I wanted to play a fast tempo, and I got my fast tempo. That's exciting. And let's take a quick look at, there's a famous high passage. It's rare that this music goes that high. I like to do just one shift in that scale on the way up, so have myself in third position. And now I'm parked here, I do have to cover a fifth with that one. So even though I shift up to a D, I'm not going to cover the fifth right then. That's a little bit too much to ask. But I have a chance to reset it here. So after I play the high G, I move that finger so it covers both strings. Reach it down a whole step. Now here I keep the hand, I'm in fifth position. I want to keep the hand there. I don't want to move it back at all. Just reach the one back a half step. All the rest of the notes I still finger in fifth position. So leave the hand here. There's no other way to be quite so reliable there. And then back down. Another couple of famous bars that I might have mentioned before the playthrough, but it's these where you really have to reach the one back. If you look at 47, that's one solution, which is what I do. You can also go back to first position for one beat, or two beats, or what have you, and then back. Same thing a couple bars later. That one's actually a little bit easier because it's a slightly higher position, so intervals get a little shorter. But same thing, you don't want to make it, you want to make it seamless to your listeners. And let me see if there are more questions or comments to finish up with. Pardon me if I mispronounce your name, but Shyam or Shyam, talking about the left thumb. How far does it stick up? When I first learned as a kid in Suzuki, they wouldn't let you stick it up hardly at all. They'd say, otherwise it's like a dog begging at the dinner table for scraps if it gets above there. I've since come to understand that the position of the thumb really depends on, well, the size of the hand, the length of the arms and everything, but all these other questions about where the violin goes here, where the arm goes under, how far is the hand from the fingerboard, where's the bow, all those things need to serve one factor, which is the angle at which the fingers fall onto the strings. How do the fingers look falling onto the strings? They should be a little bit more upright than flat, but not all the way upright. And the four fingers should have, as close to the same angle as you can get. I don't want my four to be, now this of course depends on the length of your fingers, you compromise where you have to, but in general I wouldn't want my four to be totally flat and my one to be almost falling over upright the other way. I want some position where I can get decently similar angle with all four fingers. So that is going to tell me where my thumb needs to go. If I have a huge hand, I'm going to have a lot of thumb left over, most likely, and some of it is probably going to be up here. However, if I have a big hand, my hand's probably going to be further from the fingerboard anyway, in which case more of my thumb is going to be under the instrument, and it might not need to stick up so far anyway. So it really depends, but the thumb should follow the lead of the fingers and not the other way around. What you don't want is for the thumb ever to be just stuck in one place without any flexibility. If you play without a shoulder rest, you don't have a choice. That thumb has to take a more active part than it might if you're playing with a shoulder rest. So you could call that a strength or a weakness, but it's just a reality. Playing without a shoulder rest, you must learn flexibility in the thumb and the best positions for the thumb in different situations. So just as a couple quick examples, if I want my freest vibrato, like on a single note, the kind of vibrato I haven't been using in this Bach, hopefully, in these last few weeks, something like that. I'm going to put my thumb fairly well under the fingerboard so that my hand swings wide and away from the neck of the instrument. If I had the thumb way up here, as I might in some fast technical passages, I'd be restricted in how my hand might be able to move in the vibrato. So that might be a place I'd have it under, and then bring it back if I had to. Something like that. I don't have a huge hand, so mine's never going to be way up there, but this is more or less my default. It's probably just a little bit of it sticking up. And you mentioned that you see different fine violinists having different positions, and that's why. Different hand shapes and, maybe different priorities for how they want their fingers falling on the strings. Good. And Charlotte, you have good questions about the bowing patterns. Since I have the privilege of working with you during the week, I'm going to get more into that, individually, because it'll just take a little time. I think I get to work with Charlotte in my Virtuoso Master course, which is a great pleasure. So, Samantha, you ask about, is this about the same tempo as the E major Preludio? It's not that different a character, I don't think. If anything, maybe this is a little more grand if I wanted to try and put words to it. Whereas the E major is more celebratory, fanfare type thing. This is bringing something to a close. The E major Preludio is, starting something off. How does that affect the tempo? I don't know. It's different meters, right? I think of that E major Preludio also fairly fast. That one seems more overtly virtuosic to me, and that'll be the very next movement that we get into next week on Monday. That seems pretty fast for the C major. Not unplayable. Feels a little fast. So I suppose I would say that this C major I would put just a little bit under the E major Preludio. Good. Just a couple more. Susan, you ask about getting a nice bite to the sound. Well, a couple factors will help. One is having your listeners stand only 2 feet away from you, which is basically where you're sitting to hear me. That's how far my microphone is from the violin. It's just 2 feet away. So when I play, you're hearing every bit of the scratch and the bite. I always like to say, if you think I sound good here, just imagine how amazing it would be a few more feet away. So that's probably the biggest factor. I mean, I am conscious of needing to grab the string, especially those lower and thicker strings, to get them to sound. And that is done differently in different parts of the bow. Toward the frog, it's done more with the weight distributed to the pinky side of the hand, right? So here the pinky is very, it doesn't look active necessarily, but I can feel it as being active on the bow. As you get toward the middle, the weights, or the balance point of the bow, I should say, the weight is evenly distributed, first finger to pinky, and then of course toward the tip and in the upper half of the bow, it's almost all on the first finger side of the bow. So it's getting practiced at distributing that weight so that you're not putting extra effort into a part of the hand or the arm where it doesn't need it or where it's too much, because then you'll get not a bite, but you'll drag the bow and get a scratch. And yeah, you want your instrument well enough set up as well, and strings that are not terribly old will help with that too. It's all the sorts of things that you take care of if you need to sound your best on a daily basis. You're probably going to change your strings more often, you're going to take your instrument to the shop more often, all that good stuff. But mostly has to do with the three variables, right? Bow speed, pressure, and contact point, and the ability to change those in any part of the bow. Wonderful. Thank you once more for sharing, giving your time, to spend it with me and with Bach. And next week will be the last week for Bach on the road. If you saw the email I sent today, it doesn't have to be the last time I see you this summer. I'll have some fun news for you next week if you get my emails. So if you don't, then you want to, head to natesviolin.com. Make sure you let me know where I can stay in touch with you, because early next week I'll have an announcement to make about some summer activities that should be fun, and a chance for us to spend some more time together, and get outside of Bach too. Although it'll be interesting how few techniques there are going to be that don't appear somewhere in these 6 sonatas and partitas. Maybe some fingered octaves. Maybe that's not in the Bach. But if you want to spend some more time this summer going more in depth and in different kinds of music and have a lot of fun as well, early next week I'll have some announcements to make about that. But next week, the E major partita. All these are my favorite, but that's certainly one of my favorites. So I hope you'll be back for that. Look forward to seeing you really soon. Bye for now.